our electoral system. So yes, it is keeping me awake.
Thank you, Birol. Let me just say to all of you, that's a pretty broad brush question I asked, and I've got plenty of meaty questions aimed at each of you. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. So on this sort of broad setup, to try to be as brief as you can. Thank you. Stephanie.
So I'm actually sleeping pretty well right now, and that's because I'm working very hard on a project to help protect the election. And when I do lose sleep, it's because there's a bug in my code that I don't know how to fix yet. But I have lost a lot of sleep in the past years. You know, we want government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and that requires elections of the people, by the people, and for the people, and we have gotten out of the habit in this country of the by the people part. So it starts with voting, but that's just the beginning of being connected to how elections are done. Not just knowing for yourself how you're going to vote, but helping your neighbors figure out how they're going to vote, observing at the polling place or wherever votes are cast and counted. These are important things that are not part of everybody's conception of their civic duty or what they do, and that's crucial, and it's even crucial for cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is linked to physical security. It's linked to the processes we have in place for moving machinery from one place to another, or all sorts of things like that. So I was the chair of the Philadelphia County Board of Elections in Pennsylvania in 2012, which was also a big, important election that people were very worried about. And I just want to give you a sense of who was in the room. So first of all, there was a couple people from the voting machine company that had built the voting machines that we used. They were in the room. There was actually the person who handles the computer stuff for the Philadelphia County Board of Elections now is really terrific. But back in the day, this was my first year on the board, all the programming was done by a guy who was just known by everyone as Cowboy, because he, you know, he did the programming he needed to do, and then, you know, he would like take off for days at a time and just disappear, and no one would discipline him because he was the only one who knew how to do what needed to be done. The whole Board of Elections, the staff, you know, these are not high-paying jobs. I mean, being on the board is a high-paying job because it's an old political sinecure. But the day-to-day, it's run by people who have just founded. It's run in a context of stuff that's not well funded, and that has to do with cybersecurity too, because cybersecurity has to do with people and access. What does it take to compromise someone inside a board of elections or inside a voting machine vendor to get the access that makes the cyber attack easier or less detectable? And this, you know, we need elections by the people. Which means not only that we have to be watching, but that if we value them, we need to fund them so that they can be well run and we can minimize the risk of compromise from outside. So that's what kept me up for a long time.
Did Cowboy just disappear off into the desert, or is he out there roaming around protecting us like the Lone Ranger now?
You know, I don't know what Cowboy's doing. When I came in, I wanted to have some formality. I used to call everybody Mr. This, Dr. That, Mr. That, this. And I finally gave up. I just started calling him Mr. Cowboy.
Thank you. That's great stuff. Doug, how about you? How are you sleeping?
Not very well. The challenge of being involved with computer security is that people are asking you to to think up what could go wrong. And so you develop these long catalogs of the threats we face and the risks we face. And right now, you know, every time I come up with a worst case scenario, the next day's news seems to be setting out to top it. So right now, the idea that perhaps if the absentee votes are still coming in the day after the election because the postmark deadline is the night before the election, states that are battleground states could see their totals swinging one way or the other. And we now have a threat of a real threat of insurrection with the possibility of armed bands surrounding courthouses and demanding that the count stop while their candidate is ahead. This is something which 4 years ago I didn't see as a possibility, and now it looks like something which is actually being anticipated by possibly by both parties at this point. And with this kind of thing in the air, social media manipulation from outside could be very interesting, to say the least. Not to mention the fact that every time any candidate starts talking about how the other ones are setting out to defraud the election, that can serve as license to the candidate's own supporters to engage in counter fraud. So you have the possibility that these wild claims of massive fraud can serve to justify other people conducting their own counter fraud. And I worry very much about this possibility, not to mention the fact that this large scale shift in some states to postal elections raises a whole new suite of vulnerabilities in the postal service, which to date, people haven't talked about hacking the post office as being a serious threat to US security. But suddenly, there are ways that I could imagine hacking the post office that would threaten the election.
Well, we are going to want to go down that path a little bit more with you. In fact, that was I think, basically the origin of this webinar. Birol and I were saying, what about the post office? And I kept looking, Googling, thinking there would be all kinds of articles about the post office. And there wasn't much. It's starting to be talked about now. And of course, some of the decisions that have been made about from the administration and so forth, that those articles have been around. But the hacking aspects and so forth, that was not covered very much. So we want to get back to that. Matt.
Unmute.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There are basically a couple of things that are keeping me awake at night. The first one is the security of the voter registration databases, because those have been attacked in the past. They are certain to be attacked again this time. And what happens when, for example, people are deleted from that database? How will that be handled? What will the impact be upon the election? The second one was something Stephanie touched on, which is support for the election officials. And it's support so that they understand how to use the technology that will protect them, or that is designed to protect them. One survey a friend and I would have loved to have run was, there are a number of best practices that have been published, but often people in the elections office are not computer security experts, and many of the best practices we've seen were written by and for computer security types. Is there a discrepancy about this? And if so, how big is it? It would have been a very interesting study. And to pick up on a point Doug made, it's also true for the US Post Office, although we have much less information about their cybersecurity than we do about election cybersecurity, because we've been doing election cybersecurity for a considerable amount of time. The other thing too is what are the risks of using electronic voting equipment in elections? What can go wrong with, for example, the machines people vote on? With ballot marking devices, what can go wrong there? The voters and the election officials need to understand these risks in order to make a good decision about whether or not to do something. And these risks have to be publicized so that people can understand how the election works and what steps are being taken in order to protect these risks from actually becoming threats and then incidents. So the education of the voters, how to vote and what could go wrong, and how to be an active participant in the sense of observing and understanding how things work is absolutely critical. And I see that happening, that education happening in some places. I don't see it in others, and it should be everywhere.
Now, Tom Friedman made a flat out statement the other day that this, in his opinion, this is no longer a matter of will there be a disputed election. In his view, there will be. And it's just a matter of how bad will it be and how will it unfold. Phil?
Well, I'll sleep less well beginning tonight, I suppose, with all the great points that people have made. I'll briefly speak to two concerns. Low turnout and apocalyptic journalism. Low turnout. I think at day's end, since Rick is right, the legitimacy will be questioned, if not from the very top, by millions of Americans who feel their candidate lost. And I think at the end of the day, if that is inevitable, the single best defense we have is that this record-shattering turnout. That out of some 210 million registered voters, we didn't have 60 or 70% turnout. We had 80 or even 85 or 90. That alone will be the most powerful claim of legitimacy on whoever does eventually, emerge, and there will be an emerging winner. That's inevitable. Just how much damage we'll suffer in the process is, of course, TBD. So whatever boosts turnout, and I think this speaks back to a really good point that Birol made, which is that cybersecurity concerns isn't just about hacking machines and trying to change results and screwing around with databases. It's about creating disinformation that makes people so discouraged about politics that they're just going to stay home and say the heck with it. My nightmare scenario, by the way, is a combination of those things plus really bad weather. We have the most active hurricane season going on in my lifetime. We have wildfires in the West. There's record cold in the Midwest projected this week. Imagine the convergence of those very unhappy results with chaos at the polling places, with machine breakdowns, with disinformation discouraging people from voting in bad weather. That to me is the trifecta of awfulness. And then briefly on my former so-called profession, I was a journalist for 6 years and proud of it. There's great people out there, but it is very easy for journalists to get hooked into the apocalyptic story, to focus so much on the what ifs and the awfuls that they don't take the time to understand where there are the safeguards or to explain to people how the process really works. The prayer of any election administration official, of course, is, Lord, I don't care who wins, just make it be by a big margin. That, of course, will make a lot of these concerns fade into the distance. But in the event that it's really, really close, you want journalists who really, truly understand how elections work, how recounts are involved, because it may well be a recount, which by itself means we'll have to wait longer. It's always been a fact of life, whether 2 people vote with mailed out ballots or 100 million. So educating journalists to not give platforms to people who just want to spout ignorant conspiracy theories, and who can explain to people in that circumstances of a very close and or chaotic election that's going to be really important.
Thank you. So I'm going to pick up where you just left off. What happens if the clock runs out in a number of places where they come up against their legal limit for how much time they have to count votes? How does that get resolved?
That's a complicated question. It's the exact answer is going to be different in every state and territory and jurisdiction. Okay. At the end of the day, though, if the presidential election, or if any election is not actually complete, there's a vacancy in the office, and generally there's a policy either at the state level or the federal level for what happens when there's a vacancy. So.
Presidential
the current presidential term ends on January 20th, come what may.
So what if it's vacant?
There's a congressional act that has an order of succession. It goes to the vice presidency if that's also vacant, which it would be in this case. The Speaker of the House serves as president until the vacancy is resolved.
It's just that easy?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I read some law blogs, and there's a lot of discussion about, the constitutional basis for that.
In the House of Representatives and the Supreme Court, and on and on and on.
But that's what's written in the law, and unless that gets effectively challenged, that's what happens.
Rick, let me also point out that there's an arrogance among both politicians, and I'm a recovering one, and journalists, I'm also one of those, that they call elections or that candidates declare victory or concede defeat. That's just all nonsense. They don't have that power. Elections are officially certified by each state, and as Stephanie mentioned, it varies. Some states are required to do it within 15 days. They ought to change that. No reason to be in that much hurry. More typical is 20 or even 30 days. Still plenty of time to send electors to Washington, D.C. or send the votes to Congress. But that official certification has always been part of the landscape. And this is a really good example of people doing apocalyptic journalism. The fact that you can't call an election on election night itself, it's always been the case. Any election that's close enough that requires a recount is probably going to go at least 20, 30 days out. In fact, that's after it gets certified. So understanding these basic rules and communicating them so that we don't stampede people into premature judgments is really important. And so more time to count the votes. States can do that on their own. But in the meantime, there is a fair amount of time right now to resolve the vast majority of issues.
So maybe both Birol and Doug can jump into this. On paper, all of that sounds fine, but we've never been up against an enemy so focused on this asymmetrical warfare that involves both cyber activity synchronized with disinformation, and then a president of the United States that seems to be kind of working hand in hand with the whole thing. And so everything might be A-okay out there, but they're doing everything they can to make sure that it does not look that way and to distort the picture. And, we all talk about, you hear it all the time, on Republicans say it and Democrats say it, this is the most important election in the nation's history. Well, if it is, then according to what Birol says about Soviet military doctrine and asymmetrical warfare, they also view it as the most important election, certainly in the history of the Soviet and Russian republics.
Let me try to give some framework for that. Remember, there was an election that Putin almost lost. And that election showed him the power of social media. And they moved very swiftly, being Russia, to silence all social media practically that's not under Putin's direct control. And then turned it into a massive weapon, domestic and foreign. We have reports from Department of Homeland Security that says Russians have immensely increased in social media criticism of mail-in voting. It just fits into the attempt to discredit, build mistrust and whatnot in the system. That's one. The second one that I'm trying to find an answer to is I read two reports. One, the Russians themselves claiming that their hackers have hacked into Michigan voter registration and have a list of 7.6 million Michigan voters in their possession, which has been refuted by the cybersecurity arm of DHS. But I don't know where we lie on this right now, okay? Do they have it or not? And if they have it, how the heck they got it? And what can they do with it? And you can imagine what you can do if you had an open entry into this system. What I call is in the cyber warfare with the Russians is the backdoor entry into the system from local and state levels, the soft underbelly of the United States. And that's where things get very nasty.
Doug, can you?
Cyber Command has reached out to many states and asked for work with the National Guard in these states to alert them about cyber attacks during elections.
And so, Doug, if you could pick up there too and add your
Okay.
2 cents, but also on this aspect of it, we as I understand it, we know they're in, right? We know that they were in Florida and some counties. I understand it's kind of a mystery as to why they did not act or execute in operational changes. And maybe in a second, Matt can pick up on that too. But yeah, you just go ahead, Doug.
So first, I'd like to refer back to something Phil said about the press. I think apocalyptic journalism is a threat, but another problem the press has, and this was particularly apparent in Florida 2000, is the press homes in on the low-hanging fruit. The story that's easy to tell attracts press attention, sometimes to the exclusion of the other stories. And in Florida 2000, it appears that people who dug into the election afterwards, I dug into all the optical scan ballot tabulation in Florida afterwards and found a comedy of errors, and that did not eclipse the hanging Chad, but may have accounted for almost as many votes. There were other people who looked at the absentee ballot processing in Florida and found that the very biased handling, differences from county to county and how ballots were counted. And those stories didn't show up in the press very much at all, and yet they may have added up to much bigger than the Palm Beach County hanging Chad. That worries me. Now back to the social media question and the Russian threat. The threat there is quite real, and the way Russia is dealing with social media is a threat. But I'm not really sure that we're looking at the right thing, because we keep looking at what happened 4 years ago and expecting a repeat, and they keep finding new roads of attack. 4 years ago, I'm convinced that Russia didn't pull the trigger on their voter registration database access because they didn't need to. They found that hacking the electorate was easier than hacking the machinery of the election. And so that's why we're so concerned this year with the social media attack. and as to Russian access to voter registration databases, there's a sense in which the voter registration databases nationwide are public record. And I'm sure they have the public part of the database. That is the list of all the registered voters in every state and a little bit of the history of those voters, which elections those voters voted in. In most states, that's available for a nominal fee from the Secretary of State. All you have to do is turn in a form promising not to use that information for commercial purposes. You're not going to use it to sell soap, but you can use it to direct advertising at people or to manipulate voters in any way you wish.
So when you say they didn't really need to, well, why not? I mean, why not go ahead and do it? Is there a deterrent? Is there a downside for them?
The selective dumping of media, selective dumping of stolen information through WikiLeaks and manipulation of the news cycle by extraordinarily well-timed dumps of information, I think ended up determining the election.
Yeah, also the Russians are always thinking 4 years in advance, at least. They're all chess players.
Right. So Matt, can you enlighten us on the vulnerability of the machinery, so to speak, aspect of this? And if in so doing, you could touch on the Postal Service aspect too, please.
I don't think the mute button likes me.
Anyway,
Vulnerabilities are a function of both the machine and the environment in which they're used. And so both of those have to be taken into consideration. As an example, one of the fundamental rules is that you never hook the machines that are going to be, which people will vote on. You never hook them up to the internet. All the machines that tally the votes and so forth, all those should be on local networks, not on the internet.
But they are on the internet, correct?
There are reports that some of the machines are on the internet, yes. I know that in some states, it's okay to have a wireless card in there as long as it's turned off. You have to be sure that the card can't be turned on remotely. Also,
now, excuse me if I may.
Yes.
So is this something that the average person who's operating these machines, are they familiar with the implications of whether they use one of these cards or not, or you know that it could lead to vulnerability of enormous vulnerabilities? Are they processing things like this?
No, the average voter sees the machine, votes on it, and that's it. They don't know anything about the construction of the machine, how it's hooked up, what it's hooked up to, and so forth. And this is the sort of thing you might ask the election officials about, namely, are these machines connected to the internet? But the voters should not have to understand how a wireless card works or anything like that, okay? They should simply know that if the machine is connected to the internet, there's a risk. The other thing too is that the software for the machines and I suppose the hardware need to be very thoroughly checked. And a good question is, how does that done at the state level? Some states do a very thorough job, others do a much less thorough job. And another vulnerability arises when the machines are not adequately tested before use. The general rule is you do something called the logic and accuracy test before you release the machines to be voted on. How thorough is that test done? At one point in one particular state that will remain nameless, they voted on one part of the ballot and then said, yep, that's right, machine's good. That's not the sort of test you really want. You want something much more thorough. And again, a lot of these are questions that people can ask, not specifically in detail, but just how do you know the machines are working? What are they connected to? And so on and so forth. What are the procedures? The other vulnerability, which really is tied to both the machines and the election itself, is what I call a credibility attack. For example, if certain aspects of the machines are not implemented properly, the votes will be counted correctly, but initially they can be reported differently. A good example of this was one vendor, and this problem has been fixed, that sent results over a phone line to Election Central, and it was encrypted for secrecy. Well, secrecy doesn't matter because precinct results are typically posted, at least they are in California. What matters was integrity. Can those votes being transmitted be changed? And the answer was it was very easy to do. Now, when the cards arrived at Election Central and were counted, those would be the official results of record. But that typically happened 3 to 4 days afterwards. And so this is a problem that we're going to see a lot, probably see a lot of in this election, not related to the machinery, but related to the counting of absentee or vote by mail ballots, because I doubt that they'll all be counted by the end of, by election night.
So perception of credibility is hugely important.
It's critically important as far as the machines go.
We have a president of the United States, the most visible person on the face of the earth, with a megaphone already telling us that we should question the credibility of these results, that those ballots aren't even, you shouldn't even be dealing with them. He says things like, well, if we didn't have those ballots, you know, then we'd have a, you know, we'd have a good election, and I'll, you know, I'll be part of the transition if I, you know, need to be. I mean, the president of the United States. Bill, you feel like...
Rick, there's an irony though, because the president is not so far questioning the accuracy of the ballots on machines. And there'll be about, I think, 30 million plus votes, maybe in that neighborhood, voted on these ballot marking devices. But he's actually questioning the validity of the ballots that will be marked directly by voters on paper, with an actual paper record directly marked by voters.
Yes.
That can be the ultimate decider in a case of a very close election. So the conversation we're having about election integrity in an interesting way has inordinately focused, I'd argue, on the part of the system that is the most decentralized and in some ways the least easy to hack in a really meaningful way. Now, I want to hear about the Postal Service vulnerabilities because I think that's an important part. But if you think about how you mitigate risk, not eliminate it completely, but mitigate it, you decentralize how the ballots are actually distributed and where they're marked. There's nothing more decentralized than sending it to everybody's home and kitchen, you know, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of kitchen dining room tables. And then you have an actual physical paper record at day's end if you get into really big questions about that.
The irony is
but when the questions arise, as I understand it, they're mostly going to come from the mail-in ballots because it'll take longer to process them, and that's what will be in question. And in all probability, it will look like Trump has done very, very well on election night. And so from a perception standpoint of being able to suggest that there's something wrong here, you know, that it helps that he's concentrating on the place where the most controversy is likely to emerge in this election.
I'd like to point out one more thing that, at least to me, is very ironic. One of the rules of elections that people who study voting machines push is you need paper. You need a physical representation of the ballot so that when you count or do a recount or do an audit, you don't go back to the machine, you go to the ballot. And so now the paper is being spoken of as untrustworthy, when really that's the thing that is, at least to my mind, most trustworthy. And so the role reversal is ironic. The other thing too, which Phil and a couple of others have brought out, are about ballot marking devices. One of the questions we have about those is, after people vote, they'll get a piece of paper. They'll either insert it and vote, or they'll the ballot marking device will print it off. Depends on how it works, how the machine works. And then the voter takes it and drops it in the ballot box. Do they check that their votes were recorded correctly? That's one thing any voter can do.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
that's hugely important, hugely important. And anytime you let a computer into the process, you need to check that it did its job. And this is a point where we're putting the burden on the voters to check, and they're not educated or ready for that burden. It's the science that we have says that they don't look, and when they do look, they don't do a particularly good job of checking. And by the way, calling these things ballot marking devices when a lot of them are just voters put their, they just enter what they want on the screen and a thing is printed out. It's not a ballot in the sense that it was presented to the voter with all the choices on it.
It's basically a printing machine.
So I want to make a couple of comments. The one important point is that people keep saying, and this particularly voting machine vendors keep emphasizing, our machines are never connected to the internet, they're secure. And in fact, we know that in many cases, the vendors were misrepresenting the truth. Their machines were connected to the internet. But in addition, it's really important to remember that computer viruses were invented before computers were connected to the internet. I believe the original invention came from students at Squirrel Hill High School in Pittsburgh working on Apple IIs. And they wrote viruses that were transmitted by floppy disk. That same technology is still available today on various kinds of USB sticks. That's the kind of virus transmission device that's very important in the attacks the United States made on the Iranian centrifuges. That attack works extraordinarily well against voting machines. In fact, it has been demonstrated that you can build viruses that propagate from voting machine to voting machine through the memory sticks that are inserted in them to program them. So we have to remember that vulnerability exists. And that will affect postal equipment just as much as it affects voting machines.
So, Birol, I'm gonna catch up to you, but I just want to pick up on what you said very quickly. What is the, we keep talking about things that we know exist and capabilities that we know exist, things we know, quote unquote, can do. What is the deterrent to keep the Russians from? What's the downside? What would they be afraid of? Particularly, I don't want to be political here, but with this president that seems to be very forgiving of just about everything they do.
Can I add to?
But no, I'm wondering what the deterrent is to keep the Russians from going all out.
There is no deterrence there. I don't see one, because this is uncharted waters that changes so fast. That just reminded me with his point. And this isn't, I don't want to just sound like it's coming from the Russians. It could come from anybody.
Sure.
And it could come from average Joe who just wants to create some excitement. And there may be a bunch of malware just sitting around in various systems, like sleeper cells of terrorists.
Okay.
You just, remember Born Identity, maybe a phone call, the asset wakes up and goes and kills somebody. You press the button and the program starts holding the entire county hostage.
Well, I'm just saying, you guys are scaring me, because if the possibilities are limitless and they're already in and they know how to do it and there's no deterrent whatsoever, that's not a very comforting picture.
It's not.
Oh.
Okay. So having established that.
Well, here's some comfort, Rick, in terms of how to maybe citizens especially can think about it. If people are focused on the time after election, whether that turns into election week or election month, I would focus on the month before the election, which is right now, and note that the more people that vote early prior to election day, whether they do it with a mailed out ballot or they do it in an early in-person voting, which is an option that many states offer, the more, again, you decentralize the problem, because if it comes to the point that only 30% of all votes cast were actually cast on election day itself, it's going to be hard to say, well, that ought to stand as the final results. And there's only actually a few states that are prohibited by ridiculous state laws from even processing their ballots in a timely manner. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania are the three big ones. But in a lot of the other key states, they'll start processing them as soon as they come in. And the counting of the ballots itself is one of the quickest, simplest things in the Western world. You buy a high-speed tabulator, you run these things through very rapidly, pull an all-nighter if you need to. They'll be done by 8 a.m. The following morning, if not by midnight. The real bottleneck with all these mailed out ballots is in these three states where you can't even do the signature verification or take them out of the envelope, okay, to then put in the counting pile until the day of the election. And citizens who are worried about this, about what they can do, one thing is, if they have relatives in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, tell them to demand that their legislators fix these stupid laws. But the other thing is to just, make a voting plan, but encourage people to try to get their ballots in as soon as possible. And I think this is an election where a lot of people are going to know what they want to do probably right now. So why wait till November?
So, I think you're making a great point, because we hear just in general, but vote early. A lot of people recommend, but I'm not sure people know why they're supposed to do that. And I think what you're recommending there does connect to this perception problem. The earlier people vote, you're saying the more you are inoculating yourself from a mess or something that can be distorted into, we got a big problem here. The results, Trump won on election night. Now it's upside down. So the earlier they vote, the greater the potency of the ability to create those distortions. Okay, I want to get one quick one to you. I'm getting signals that we're moving toward audience question here.
But look, there's a really, really important thing that people can do after the election, and that is go and observe what's happening at your local board of elections. And if I can put a plug in for verified voting, there are lots of resources on that website that will help you be a good observer at your board of elections. But the short thing is just find out when the counting is happening and just go and watch and be part of it. You will never regret it, I promise you.
Okay, that's good, great. That's great advice. Hey, one very quickly. So in Pennsylvania, where there is this controversy about the mail-in, the so-called naked ballots, where people are not used to dealing with the security envelope, or at least they don't think they're going to be able to deal with it. I'm curious, Phil, about the learning curve with Oregon. Was there a large number of problems with people not knowing how to fill out and use those envelopes properly in the beginning? And then did it improve over time as they got used to it? Or what's your take on that?
Yeah, it improved over time and very quickly. The question about the so-called, quote, naked ballot in Pennsylvania, and there's some entertaining internet videos out there that have gone viral, is that there's a secrecy envelope that voters in Oregon can use, but are not required to. So if you stick your ballot in, just the envelope, it'll get counted. But for whatever reason, again, this isn't the
Oh, I didn't know that.
really
I thought I had to do it.
No, it's the pantheon of stupid rules. Pennsylvania apparently requires you and says that if you don't put it in a secrecy envelope, it doesn't count. So the voter can, in a sense, relinquish their privacy.
Okay.
But that's being challenged in court now, and we'll see what happens. It might be something that an executive order can overturn because it's just silly and serves no purpose. But you're right. Over time, people learn how to do any voting system better if they get more familiar with it. And a lot of people who made mistakes in their primary elections by forgetting to sign a ballot, for example, won't make that mistake again in the general.
Okay. I need to speak out to, and I don't quite know how to do this, to whoever our Wizard of Oz is behind the curtain. I'm getting these messages that it's time to move on to the audience questions, but I don't see any questions. So as I await information on what the heck I'm supposed to do, does anybody want to venture an answer to this question? How does it all end? Not necessarily in terms of the victor, although that can be part of your theory too, that it's being, sort of things are being manipulated toward a victor. But how does it all end? Go ahead, Birol.
I can just plug in one thing, that if you're a concerned voter, get informed and just don't stick to your own little silo of information. Technology has turned this information warfare into little silos that you can now go 24/7 only listening to whatever the heck you want to listen. I mean, the days of Walter Cronkite, etc., gone. And now I remember, when this whole technology business was getting into the information age, 80s, people were saying how wonderful art this is. It's an elemental power. Information equals power. You can control it, you can manipulate it, you can brainwash your audience. Yeah, of course, some people would say, oh, this is nonsense. I'm just going to listen to what I want to listen 24/7. Well, wonderful. You're not adding much to a pluralistic democratic system. You're just perpetuating what you want to believe in. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Get informed, make an intelligent decision.
Well,
Yeah,
the first question, go ahead,
I want to add, I agree. So, take it every week, take an hour out of your doom scrolling and instead watch a meeting of your local county council or city council, because that's where it starts. I feel like, everyone's got their hair on fire right now, and it's like the wildfires. You can't just think, when the fire is burning over the ridge, that's not the time to do a controlled burn. But you need to do the controlled burns. Don't get distracted by the wildfire. Well, get distracted and be safe. But when the fire is not burning, that is when you need to do the hard work. And it is hard work, and it's boring, and it's dull. But go to those county council, city council meetings. Get involved at the ground floor in your local politics, because the presidential contest is not the only one out there, and the other ones matter a lot.
Well, I'm glad you just said that, because the first question was, what else can citizens do? I'm just getting asked questions too about what are the deterrents. I think we've answered that question. There are none, I think. Can blockchain help with security?
I think blockchain is a great buzzword, and it attracts a lot of capital from people who don't know what they're spending money on. But it's not at all clear that blockchain solves any of the interesting problems in the world of elections.
Actually, I'd go further than Doug and say it doesn't solve any of the problems. As he said, it's a real nice buzzword, but it's not clear how that can be used at all to improve the security and integrity of the election without compromising the secrecy of the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
I want to add to that with a little bit of 19th century history and see if this is relevant, particularly to the computer scientists on the panel. There's been a couple of really long major articles in the last month. The New Yorker had one by Sue Halpern that looked at how things like blockchain can kind of, in a sense, cut the Gordian knot, find this perfect balance between security and the privacy of the ballot. And this privacy of the ballot notion, I think in some ways needs to be re-examined, because if you stop back and think about it, when people say, I want my ballot delivered to me in my home by the Postal Service, rather than me having to go to my ballot. And that's the fundamental policy choice we made here in Oregon that others are going to wrestle with. By definition, you as the voter are giving up a small modicum of privacy, okay? You don't control, the government doesn't control and insist on you doing this in private, which is the insistence, if you think about it, in the voting booth, okay? And I think what's happened in Oregon and other states that have adopted our model, and in order to get the benefits of much higher turnout and having more time to deal with issues on the ballot and feel more informed, is they've in effect said, I'm willing to give up a very small modicum of privacy in exchange for all these other benefits. It's on paper, it's easier to recount, et cetera. So I think that there's an interesting conversation here. Back in the 19th century, ballots were not private in this way. And if you look at the history of Reconstruction, I happen to be reading a book right now about that era, which is fascinating. The southern states that were instituting Jim Crow and fighting, the whites were fighting to deprive blacks of meaningful access to the polls. They found in the secret ballot a wonderful device to force people to go to a poll, and therefore they could keep them from voting because blacks were not safe showing up at a polling place to vote. And if you think about, if we reverse the polarity and get people to get their ballots sent to them, yeah, you give up a tiny bit of, quote, privacy, but what do you gain in terms of access and equity and getting a lot more people to cast their ballots? So I think it's just this privacy, the secrecy of the ballot versus the integrity of the system. I think we're going to continue to wrestle over this. And I agree that blockchain, it, in a sense, solves the wrong problem, even if you agree that it is a good thing.
So
here's a good question. What can average people do to fight against the social media?
A couple of Doug had a, I think, response.
John Stuart Mill is a great commentator on this question of ballot secrecy. He was against the secret ballot because he believed we were moving towards a society where people were more equal and where nobody would have significant amounts of power over another person, because social differences, the difference in power between different people, was in decline, as he was writing. And he believed that eliminated the need for a secret ballot. Right now, we seem to be in an era when power differences between different people are increasing to a level that's really rather astronomical. And that puts people in a position where they can be coerced. And the whole purpose of a secret ballot is not to provide me with privacy, but to provide me with the assurance that your vote wasn't bought. So I need to know that you're not selling your vote for me to trust the outcome of the election. And that, you know, if we lived in a world where we really had serious equality, where people didn't have different levels of strength and power and money, I don't think there would be any need for equality, because you couldn't buy my vote, and you couldn't buy your vote. On the other hand, in an era when 1% of the population has 50% of the wealth, the secret ballot becomes extraordinarily important. So that's John Stuart Mill's argument, and I think it's one that
one other point, security is always a trade-off.
Maybe he was right.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Matt.
I was saying that security is always a trade-off. And the question is, what is more important to you? And I think both Doug and Phil made some good points here. That's a policy issue that has to be decided by the voters or the policymakers or whomever.
Well, I want to address one thing that has become a rallying point for secrecy and security in elections in Europe, and that's Estonia. I don't know much about the details of it, but since they were attacked by Russian thugs and as well as the government, and developed their KSI blockchain, which has taken took a lot of attention, has been promoted. And they say that it is the most secure system of protecting voter, and the system cannot be hacked using the if they use the KSI blockchain for security. Hearing otherwise here, and so the question that came up was, can that system be used at a state level in the United States, not a national level, because we're federal, right? And we got elections are at state level, pretty much, and become a model for other states to follow for a national network. Is that an optimal 21st century election system? Is that what it looks like? What are its pitfalls?
So,
Are the Estonians as open as they were before?
so when I was evaluating the Dutch election system, my partner in that evaluation was the developer of the Estonian system.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lot of long talks about the Estonian system. One of the prerequisites that the Estonian system rests on is a national ID card system where every single citizen of Estonia has a national ID card which contains a cryptographic chipset in it that allows that person, by inserting their ID card in any ATM anywhere, to have secure access to the Estonian system. That, and you can also get card readers that you can hook on your USB port, so you can do them locally. That requires something that the United States has been extraordinarily reluctant to do, and that is to have a single unified national citizenship register. We don't do it because it requires trust of the central government of a type that we have never extended in the United States. I think most US citizens on the left or the right would consider it to be a sign of a totalitarian government if we were required to register with the government anytime we moved for more than 2 weeks from one residence to another in order to keep the government database of our current locations up to date. In countries that do that, there are real benefits. If they can't find you to send you a tax form, it's their problem, not yours. Whereas in the US, it's entirely your problem if you don't pay taxes. Things like that. But we just don't do that. And I think most of us, the idea of an internal passports, it sounds totalitarian. And yet that's what it takes to have a system like the Estonians have. We're just nowhere near doing that.
I would have to agree. I don't think the American character can absorb that.
There's also another problem. Some people, Estonia has not been open about how their voting system works, but some people found out, some people took an equivalent system and analyzed it and found it had all sorts of architectural and security problems. And so they were not able to do it on the actual Estonian system, but they did it on a system that was basically a clone of it. So I'm not sure it's a good idea to adopt the Estonian system.
The Estonian system is incredibly vulnerable to insider fraud on behalf of the system administrators. So if you can trust someone to run your system for you, it might actually be a great system. But the problem is whoever you trust might eventually become the Praetorian Guard and end up picking your emperor for you.
And can you see the American politician who's out there pressing for the Estonian system, how that's going to go over? Hey, Phil, a question for you.
Yeah.
Is it the case that most states have prepaid postage for vote-in mail or not?
It's about half and half, and some have gone that route just in 2020. Oregon did. We didn't have it until this cycle. In some places, states have used their COVID money from the federal government to do it, or just other funds. I wanted to pick up on something, Rick, that you had mentioned earlier before.
Could I just finish on that one first?
Yeah.
So the reason I asked is because I really wonder, I mean, you know, there's the old saying, you know, I ain't got a dime. And,
I ain't got a stamp.
And I think that's probably true of more people than we often realize. And if you are old or frail, and you've got your gas tank is on fumes and you've got maybe you're not sure whether you got an eighth of a gallon left, going out to get a stamp
Yeah.
to vote is not something that you're likely to do.
Yeah.
Now, is that just my imagination running wild, or
no,
is that an issue?
It definitely is an issue. Young people often don't have stamps too. Now, one thing that's not very well known is that if you stick a ballot in the mailbox and it doesn't have a stamp on, it will get delivered. What happens is the Postal Service will just send the local election office a bill for the unpaid posting. I think if people ask what can citizens do, encourage your Congress people wherever you live to pass a very simple fix. Require the U.S. Congress to pay for every ballot that goes out in both directions. Relieve the local governments of those costs, relieve the citizens of those costs of returning it, and just make it a democracy stamp, as it were. But I want to, Rick, you had mentioned earlier about the Postal Service and the cyber vulnerabilities there, and I think it's important to recognize there may well be some. Again, they rely on high-speed equipment. Some of it's connected to the internet. It can be hacked with USB sticks with malware probably too. And the Postal Service has been much maligned, and Congress has done an abysmal job of supporting it. They've put requirements on it to act as if all their pension obligations must be fully funded in the here and now. It's they're not allowed to make certain cost-cutting savings, but are required to be, profitable. And the dismantling of the Postal Service and the infrastructure is a concern of mine. Now, I think they'll rise to the occasion. There's some really dedicated people. They know the world is watching. But over the long term, we have got to make a renewed investment in the Postal Service infrastructure. Whether other states copy the Oregon model or revert back to the polling place and make mail ballots less common than not, there's still going to be a lot of people voting this way. And even if we dodge these bullets in 2020, we need to put a lot more investment into the Postal Service to make sure that its systems are as secure and as hack-proof as possible. So I want to applaud your point that you made earlier, is there needs to be a lot more looked into about that as well, because it could affect not just Oregon system, but any system, because every state allows voting by mail, and every state will continue to do that. Just a matter of how much.
Well, that relates to another question we have here. What can average people do to fight against the social media influence campaign? And I'm against vote by mail.
Tell all your friends and relatives who live in other states there's nothing to fear and it works great. We, of course, have had no problems of fraud. And I'll go back to what a clerk once told me years ago, because I was concerned about it. You got all those ballots out there. And she said, Phil, have you ever asked why counterfeiters never counterfeit pennies? A question I had not asked myself actually before then. And she told me, Phil, if you're willing to risk the jail time and do the crime, you go with 20s and 100s. And this, again, is what protects you. It's not that fraud is impossible or doesn't happen. A little bit of it does. I think 0.00004% incidents over Oregon's experience. But if you decentralize it and make it so hard to be worthwhile. I mean, to steal an election by mailed out ballots, you got to do it one felony at a time, one ballot at a time. And that's a fool's errand, okay? Whereas a single software hack might be capable of dealing with tens of thousands or more particular votes. So I would encourage people to recognize that there is one piece of national infrastructure here that's common to every state, and that is the U.S. Postal Service. And whether 1% of the people vote by these mailed out ballots or 100% in very close elections, any one of those ballots can count. Encourage people to be supportive of the Postal Service, which I think is one of the great innovations of the American constitutional experiment, and thank Benjamin Franklin for that. And let's honor that.
Which is also why because of its history, its revered history, also a reason why the Russians might view it as a special prize.
So
Anyway, so go ahead.
in many states, the election offices are allowed to install ballot drop boxes. Last time I was in Portland, one of the things that impressed me was this large box next to one of the trolley lines that said ballot drop box on it in big letters. And you don't have to trust the US mail to vote by mail. You can get a ballot mailed to you, fill it out, and in many, many states, you can hand deliver it to the election office in the county building or to a ballot drop box on the grounds of the county building. And if you're in a state that's a little bit better at it, there'll be ballot drop boxes in supermarket parking lots. There was one incident I'm aware of in Colorado where a ballot drop box was left from the end of one election to the beginning of the next before someone noticed it was full of ballots. But by and large, people do collect these ballots, and the processing is done very conscientiously. So that one incident aside, ballot drop boxes, particularly the ballot drop box at the county building, is a great way to express your distrust for the mail while taking advantage of the opportunity to vote without having to go to a polling place and stand in a long line.
Yeah, and in some states, Pennsylvania is one of them, a voter can go to the county board or any of its satellites and in one visit, request their ballot at the counter, vote it, turn it in. So that that's a terrific thing to do, and contact your local board of elections to see if that's possible, and if not, what the closest thing to that is.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're coming very close to the end here. Does anyone have anything they're just kind of dying to get out, or something we've missed, or is there a gaping hole in this discussion? Have we been too apocalyptic, not apocalyptic enough? Any last words of wisdom?
Regardless of how apocalyptic or not apocalyptic everyone thinks we are, do get out there and vote, because if you don't, that's a certain way to make sure your vote doesn't count.
I would say that that's a great ending to all of this. I want to thank everybody. I thought it was a great discussion. I certainly enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. Birol, maybe you have some final thoughts you want to pass along?
Well, thank you, Rick, and I thank all the panelists, and I want to extend special thanks to the staff at the Hatfield School of Government, at NPCC, as well as CPS, and heartfelt thanks to Erica, Susan, and Micah for guiding us through this panel. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next webinar.
It was fun. Thank you.